All right, thank you all so much for tuning in to yet another episode of the Professional Pricing Society podcast. My name is Terrence, and today we have a super special guest with us who is also going to be one of the keynote speakers at our upcoming conference in Las Vegas this fall, which is October 22nd through the 25th. Her name is Stephanie Yee. She is a partner at Bain Company, where she exclusively serves clients on the topics of pricing and profitability. She has led multiple successful pricing transformation programs and is a former pricing and sales senior executive at a Fortune 75 company. Stephanie holds a management information systems degree from Texas A&M University as well. Miss Stephanie, how are we doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Terrence?
Doing very, very well. We're going to be talking today about Gen AI pricing, hype or high stakes game changer. And so you have a plethora of knowledge, and you have a plethora of experience, which is why you're going to be a super popular keynote for this year's conference. And so I want to thank you, first of all, for taking the time with me to kind of share a bit of a teaser, if you will, um, on this podcast for what we're going to be discussing in the fall. Is that correct?
That's right, Terrence. Thanks for having me today. I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, not a problem at all. So let's go ahead and jump into the conversation. AI and pricing. What is new about AI, about Gen AI specifically, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's right because it's interesting because AI is feels like a very old topic, but also a very new topic in the space. So, you know, um, it's a matter of fact, pricing has actually been in a functional area, one of the most likely places across commercial functions to have introduced some type of AI and ML capabilities. So it's not necessarily new. Most of your audience, I think, knows that pricing actually has quite a bit of science behind it. But there are some new technologies available with Gen AI that's bringing this conversation to the forefront. Just to take a step back, traditional AI can be broadly characterized as really good at math, solving for a specific narrow task, typically requires a lot of data to build and train models. And Gen AI actually differs from traditional AI in a couple of different ways. Um, Gen AI at the core of it is based on large language models. And so, therefore, it's actually really good at reading and synthesizing unstructured data. So, what does that mean? It means it's really good at like reading through call transcripts, articles, basically text to understand and synthesize and summarize what that means. And because it's able to do that, it's also really great at creating unstructured data. And so with this capability, Gen AI, we're able to actually develop talk tracks, explanations, things like that. So it's actually quite good with writing text, among other things. But it's a little bit different from the traditional AI capabilities that we've historically used in pricing.
And AI is just one of those things that is continuing to evolve as time progresses. And now that it's in the realm of pricers, in the realm of pricing, how do you see this, new technology being applied to pricing in recent years, and what do you foresee in the upcoming future?
So we think Gen AI actually specifically will unlock new capabilities for pricing that just really wasn't possible before.
Mhm.
And specifically, we see three broad use cases that we're particularly excited about. And I'm happy to talk through, what these are. The first one is enabling price setting, which is one of the core activities you do as a pricer. We think this new capability will help bolster existing traditional AI ML capabilities where they have fallen short when it comes to price optimization and price setting. So, I mean, it's no secret, kind of, if you look out into the marketplace, there have been companies that are absolutely been successful using traditional AI ML approaches to derive pricing. I mean, Amazon's probably the best example that everybody knows, both in B2B and in B2C. They use a data-driven approach. They run tests and experiments. They ingest data from many different places to really optimize price.
Mhm.
But when we take this example of using AI ML to drive price optimization, and we survey companies who have undertaken, the project and the program to actually develop this capabilities through AI ML, we actually see that laggards as compared to market leaders are 2.5 times more likely to still lack effective pricing guidance when they use these traditional AI ML approaches.
Oh, wow.
And what we learned is that many of them fail to get the full value of the program. And this actually happens for three reasons. One is that AI ML approaches typically use a lot of historical internal data to develop the right price recommendation, which altogether isn't wrong or bad because those historical price points are actually tested in the marketplace. But sometimes it doesn't really account for things that are happening here and right now and other external data sources that actually might improve your outcome. The second is we still see that there is a disconnect between pricing and sales. This is an age-old issue in the world of pricing where sales doesn't fully trust the guidance, so then therefore they're not using it. And we also see that there's disparate and fragmented data across the ecosystem that can be used in pricing systematically, but is not usually incorporated because it's difficult to use. And so the capability that is unlocked through GenAI can really help address each of these shortcomings. And here's how. So this first one that I talked about where traditional AI ML really focuses on historical data, imagine a world in which you're actually able to bolster your price recommendations or more on more recent data that could impact price. So say, for example, tomorrow out in the news, your competitor announces that they're going to build new supply,
Mhm.
or if there's a supply chain disruption somewhere, in the marketplace. As an example, we worked with a chemicals client that previously invested a significant amount of time in building a pricing guidance tool based on historical AI ML capabilities. But through the pandemic and the Ukraine war, the supply demand dynamics changed massively, as you can
Mhm.
imagine. And the price recommendations based on past data just wasn't good, because it's not relevant. There's new things that are happening in the marketplace that actually should drive a different price recommendation. So they ended up, kind of moving away from their AI ML tool and started
Mhm.
doing things in spreadsheets and Excel to try
Mhm.
to really account for these latest trends. Well, fast forwarded now with this capability with Gen AI, they're actually able to capture data from some of these external sources. So
Mhm.
imagine being able to bring that in, Gen AI as a language model, being able to synthesize, hey, this is happening in the marketplace.
Mhm.
There's new capacity coming up. There's competitor price actions that we're now learning about.
Mhm.
And ingesting that can help them basically alter their price recommendation that they would have historically provided to really kind of answer questions around, is the market going to be long or short?
Mhm.
What's this company's position in the marketplace? Should they be pushing towards like a spot deal, or should they actually tie in volumes on contract because things are going to be long? What should their prices really be? And so by ingesting some of this external data that was hard to really synthesize and then bring into the pricing recommendations,
Sure.
able to actually improve the quality of their recommendations by bringing both, the traditional AI and some of these newer Gen AI capabilities together.
Mhm.
Um, I'll give you another example of one that we've been working on with a different client, where they're actually using their own customer service data to
Mhm.
inform pricing decisions. So we've recently worked with a client and they're using their Gen AI capabilities to expand their data set and bring in insight on customer service issues and delays. Because
Mhm.
actually, when you're doing pricing, very oftentimes it's a reflection of the value prop and the service that you provide. And so if there's been issues with the services that you're providing, that context is actually really important. And so
Mhm.
we're giving those kinds of information to the account executives so they have a much clearer picture of the negotiation landscape when they go to talk about pricing and do their negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as I said before, we're finding that using both traditional AI ML techniques to glean the best you can from the past, do the math to get a data-driven decisions, but also combining that with some of these newer capabilities with these language models, really provides the most powerful outcomes for price optimization. The second thing is any pricer knows is like it's not enough just to set prices. You actually have to work on getting the prices. And this is especially relevant in B2B, where there's typically some kind of salesperson that sits between the price and negotiating with the customer. And so you don't always actually get the prices that you set because some of that value gets negotiated away. So the second use case we see that GenAI can really help out with is actually with price getting. So one of the greatest sources of margin leakage comes from contract non-compliance. And so historically, when you're working with a customer, if you've got contracts, you develop contracts, and inside of these contracts, you'll have different terms and details. And most of this stuff is actually locked up in PDFs and Word documents. And that makes it really hard to know if the customers are compliant against your agreed upon terms. So terms like payment, you're supposed to pay in a certain amount of days. You have the ability to do price escalations if, input costs raises above a certain level, or there's like freight delivery terms. It's like, hey, I'm able to charge you if I need to, rush deliver something to you. Using both AI, ML, and Gen AI, we're actually now able to systematically read through these contracts and extract those terms out. And that's really powerful because it's much easier to analyze whether or not there's compliance against the terms once you've extracted out. Now I can take that and compare that to like, well, how many times have I charged you for freight? Am I, getting the full value out of it? When it's in a Word document, it's very difficult at scale to do that. But when you're able to extract those terms, imagine to like an Excel or something like that, then it becomes a lot easier to say, hey, these sets of customers, we agreed to these terms, but they're not following it. And therefore, I have this much margin dollars that I could be getting that I'm not getting. So as an example of this, I recently worked with a healthcare client, and we helped them identify 300 bips of improvement uplift on money owed to them through contract compliance.
Mm-hmm.
It was collecting on late fees that they could have, making sure that people were paying on time, things like that. And when you identify this kind of value, we were actually able to do two things with them. One is what we call kind of like ringing the cash register. So it's like, hey, your customers owe you money on these things. Like, actually go get that. That's like money that drops straight to the bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
But the second thing we were able to do from a longer term perspective was say, oh, well, you have these really beneficial terms, but it's only in these 5, contracts or 10 contracts. Like, why shouldn't you be thinking about applying it to all of your contracts? And how do you, in your negotiation process, and as you work with that customer, move them towards these beneficial terms, or at least drive like a give-get conversation on that? And so we find that most of the times our clients are pretty inconsistent in the way that they apply these beneficial clauses in their contracts. And this exercise really helped bring to life where there could be more consistent, and we were able to like communicate, what that value of being more consistent would be. So that's another exciting use case that Gen AI, I think, will unlock in terms of price getting. And then the last and the third use case is with sales enablement. And this is where I think Gen AI actually really shines and can help in several different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Most pricers will tell you that getting, sales to trust and use pricing guidance is one of the toughest changes to make in an organization. And one of the things that Gen AI can do is provide, because of that text language capability, summaries and explanations of price that can help with seller gain confidence in price recommendations.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of focus right now on how do you develop sales co-pilots that help them really like improve and be better at the things that they're doing in their job. Well, you can imagine a world in which these capabilities actually help a seller understand, why is it priced this way?
Mhm.
Going back to some of the stuff I said earlier, what's happening in the marketplace that's driving these prices? And it's able to have a two-way, almost chat-like dialogue to say, hey, give me a summary of why my price is what it is, what are the
Mhm.
main talking points and all of those good things. And in today's world, a lot of that stuff is very manual. Some pricing or sales ops team is trying to build that stuff, and it's not very dynamic. And so you can imagine a world in which you can actually greatly increase like the trust and understanding of pricing with the seller through some of these capabilities. And this really creates what we call a democratization of insights, which is really a fancy way of just saying that they have access to insights that
Mhm.
previously they would have had to go to a pricing analyst or somebody like that to get and to understand. And now they can, self-serve
Mhm.
on some of these capabilities. Um, the second thing I think that GenAI can do that really supports sales is GenAI can develop really compelling marketing and sales collateral
Mhm.
that really speaks to the value proposition of the product, the service that's in line with the prices paid. So you can imagine, if a seller is able to compellingly articulate the value of the product or service that they're selling, then, the customer feels good about the pricing that they're actually getting. It makes
Mhm.
sense. The prices paid are consistent with the value that they think that they're getting. And this capability is not only better with Gen AI, it's a lot faster. So,
Mhm.
in fact, we recently worked with a client to increase the speed at which they're able to create these good sales and marketing collateral. And think about this in terms of like the emails you need to send, the PowerPoint presentations, all of those good things. Their original turnaround time for initial copy was basically reduced from 5 days using a marketing agency to 2 days.
Wow.
So great efficiency gains. And,
Mhm.
if you kind of read up on Gen AI, they'll say that one of the most compelling capabilities is that they are really good at developing just comprehensive and compelling arguments for, whatever it is that you've prompted them to do. And then I think the third way in which Gen AI is really helping enable sellers is helping them prepare through negotiation training. So a lot of pricing value is actually eroded away during the negotiation process with the customer, as you can imagine. And now there are actually AI assisted self-learning modules that can take into account a sales rep's like previous responses as they're going through this training, and it'll generate a customer response for them to practice with. So I think in all of these different ways, Gen AI is actually going to really help upskill the seller, which in turn will actually increase, I think, the customer value, what the customer value is to the work.
Okay, so essentially, the new technology being applied in pricing, specifically with generative AI, is super beneficial. And according to you, it helps with different time efficiency, um, marketing, collateral, negotiation trainings. I mean, there's just a plethora of things that this is going to help pricers out with moving forward. And as companies continue to really grab a hold of utilizing this tool as best as they possibly can, and as their task a little bit more time efficient as far as completing those tasks. My question is, as miraculous and as awesome as something like Gen AI is, how do you suggest or what do you advise to get started in working in artificial intelligence?
Yeah, that's right. And so we think that there's four key steps to getting started.
Okay.
So the first is identifying where the money and the value is in the business to unlock. On this first step, we actually strongly encourage that pricing teams look beyond just the specific pricing use cases and actually think more broadly about the business outcomes to unlock that would be of most value to the organization. So think of this not as like, hey, I want to set my sight on just improving price recommendations, but a more aspirational goal that looks more like I actually want to increase win rates by X% for the organization. We want to increase renewal rates by X%. We want to reduce bid response time by this amount of time. And pricing, no doubt, will be a component of that solve, but there will also be other capabilities required. And we think it's important to set your sights a little bit broader to create the win and the organizational energy behind the effort. Because, I mean, just frankly, if you talk to us executive about, like, I want to improve my, how I set prices versus, hey, I want to increase our win rates, but it's just a different level of engagement that you get from those conversations. So we think the first thing is know where the value is. The second step is you got to figure out where you are in terms of your org readiness to be able to utilize some of these tools. So make no mistake, as great as AI and GenAI and all these new technologies are, they are tools. Tools enable a strategy. It doesn't make a strategy. So if you don't know how you want to price in the future as a business, a tool's not going to fix that,
Gotcha.
You will end up codifying your same old pricing practices if you don't think through and kind of define what that future state should look like. And then you'll be left wondering, okay, well, why didn't that tool work? Well, it's because you codified all your old practices that actually wasn't already working. With this new technology, you definitely will need new data sets, as we kind of talked about. You'll need new tools with GenAI and other things like that. You'll need new architecture for how that data interacts with all of your systems. You'll need actually probably different talent to enable this work. And you'll actually need commitment from your leadership to drive this change through and to get actually the resourcing that you need to do this right. So it's really important that, you identify the value, which is the first step. But the second step is you need to have a clear vision of what your starting point is so that you know where you can go. What's really more immediate next step versus long-term aspirational in your roadmap. So once you know where the value is and what your organizational capabilities are, then you can start to prioritize, well, what things can I actually tackle near term? And what things are probably kind of a little bit longer in the roadmap. So we want to get to those things, but there's more foundational things we need to do first. And there are so many use cases you can choose from. And so prioritization is really paramount. We see organizations who are early pioneers of this work falling into a couple of traps. And so when you think about prioritization, one of the things we see as a trap is doing what is easy versus what's valuable. So we've seen clients who have started to do this work on their own, and they'll enable something that's like, oh, well, this would be easy to do. But there's actually not a very clear ROI on actually doing that work. And the success metrics may not be very clear either. And so then, it's very hard to see like, well, did I get value out of this? Should I keep doing these things? And so that's one trap. The other one is one I kind of touched upon earlier, is like just starting with the use case that's so small that it's hard to really have meaningful impact. And so that's why we're recommending not just looking at just a pricing use case, but maybe a constellation of use cases that delivers an overall business outcome. And ideally, you'd actually have it tied to a common set of users from a change management perspective. So you're kind of making the change holistically. And enabling like a constellation of use cases makes it easier to create and measure a step change success. So now we're no longer talking about, oh, I improved prices for this many transactions. It's more like actually this work helped us change our win rate from 10% to 11%,
Mm-hmm.
which is more of a step change success, which is actually incredibly important when you're building early momentum for this kind of work in an organization. And so if you know where the value is, you know where your starting point is, and you've started to prioritize and you have a sense for like, okay, these are the things, this is what the roadmap's going to look like. The last thing you need to do is actually prepare your organization for change. And so that means several different things. One, you need to have clear roles and responsibilities for the team that's going to support the program. And that means they're clear on who's going to who has decision rights, who's
Mm-hmm.
accountable for execution.
Mm-hmm.
The second is, you're going to have to think about your org structure that supports a change to make sure that it creates like sustained, long-lasting changes. And so it's like, how centralized should some of these capabilities be? Should they be BU led? Like some of those decisions have to be thought through. You need a good change management program and culture in place that identifies the right sponsors, change agents, activities and communications that really foster a data culture and improves Gen AI and AI literacy across the organization. Like people have to understand, what are these technologies? Why are we using them? I mean, because I think at the core of it, people are worried about change. And especially when you talk about Gen AI and AI, people are worried about, does this mean you're replacing me? And
Mm-hmm.
so having that dialogue around, what we're trying to do in terms of improving outcomes, how these technologies can be used, and each person's role in that journey is going to be very important. I mentioned earlier that having the right talent is going to be really important. You're going to need talent that understands, AI skills.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to have to probably hire for some of these talent gaps because most people don't have necessarily, these kinds of skill sets inside of their organization today.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond just hiring, you actually need to set up programs to retain and continuously develop this talent so they want to stick around. Um, and then lastly, you'll need a governance structure that actually sets up policies on how to govern the data, how to govern the investments, who track results of pilots deployed, and really work on fully embedding like responsible AI in the target governance framework. So there's quite a few things you need to do to really prepare your organization for change and also bring them along in the
Mm-hmm.
change journey.
Mm-hmm. That's good. It's really good. I'm also glad you said originally that this is a tool and this is not something that the companies need to fully rely on. We still have to put in the
Yeah.
work and the effort to strategize and to come up with a plan,
Yeah.
centered around our pricing goals and everything in that nature. And so I'm also grateful that you mentioned that, and I didn't even think about this. You know, a lot of companies don't have an individual or personnel in their organization that is familiar with AI or Gen AI, and even if they do, what are they doing to continue that individual or those group of people to retain those people? And so that's mind-boggling. But I think as time continues to progress, programs and things of that nature will continue to kind of come to surface and give companies more reason to invest in those to be able to retain such individuals. That's a good point that you mentioned as well. But where do you see this headed? Because we've already come such a long way, but
Yeah.
there's it
It,
feels
yeah.
like it feels like it's at the starting point, to be honest.
Yeah. It's interesting because, AI/ML has been around.
Hmm.
And so, I think my talk was like, is it hype? Is it,
Hmm.
high stakes game changer or not? And the reality is that there are many examples of traditional AI being very successful and definitely tried and true. Some
Hmm.
organizations do it better than others. And as I mentioned early in the talk, Gen AI, I think is actually only going to continue to help actually improve the outcomes.
Hmm.
If I'm being perfectly honest, I think that Gen AI right now, people are experimenting with things, but
Hmm.
it's probably a little bit still more hype, than
Hmm.
reality. But this space is moving so quickly.
Yep.
It's not one of those things where it's like, oh, I can ignore it, for the next like whatever couple of years. Because the reality is that the capabilities with Gen AI has propelled the topic of AI in general to
Hmm.
the forefront of the business world. I mean, in my work with clients, I have so many, we hear so many board members, PE owners, private equity owners
Hmm.
that now want to know from the management teams, like, hey, how are you planning on leveraging these capabilities to create
Hmm.
a sustained advantage in the marketplace? And as I shared, like, using both the traditional and the Gen AI capabilities, that's only going to continue to grow. I don't care what sector you're in,
Hmm.
even if it's slow, it's going to continue to grow. And in some places, it's actually going to move pretty rapidly. And we know that market leaders are already experimenting with new
Hmm.
ways to
Hmm.
unlock value for their organizations through these new capabilities. So my advice is like, don't get caught flat-footed. You
Sure.
want to start experimenting, investing, and thinking about these capabilities because it's going to take time for you to probably build all the things that you need to internally and get things, moving in the right direction. And so I think, now is the time, if you haven't already, to be seriously thinking about how these technologies can be used to really up your game in your business.
That's good. That's good. Okay, awesome. Gen AI pricing, hype or high stakes game changer. Miss Stephanie Yee, thank you so much for your time today. We are super excited to have you as one of our keynote speakers for this upcoming fall conference. I mean, you carry such a tremendous amount of insight in this particular topic, and you have a lot of experience behind you. And so we're super grateful and excited to have you. One more question for the listeners. Where can they go to learn more about you, the company you work for, any resources you might want to kind of promote? Where can they go to learn more about those things?
Yeah, so obviously people can find me on LinkedIn, on Bain.com. We have information about our pricing practice and all of the good work we do there. And so those are ways in which you're more than welcome to reach out and
Okay.
we can continue the conversation.
All right. Well, thank you again for your time today and listeners. Until next time, we'll see you guys later. Have a good one. Bye bye.